Hi there, thanks so much for tuning in for this event. This is part of the Philosophy Today program, which is co-hosted by the Philosopher and Boston Review. My name's Anthony Morgan, I'm editor of The Philosopher. Just to give you a brief overview of the two organisations that are co-hosting this event. The Philosopher is the UK's longest running public philosophy journal. We aim to produce philosophy that is emotionally intelligent, challenging, formally innovative and socially just. In addition to the magazines we put out, we run these events, we run a podcast and have some exciting plans for the new year. We are unfunded and rely 100% on community generosity. So if you enjoy watching this event, please consider making a small donation via our Patreon page, which is patreon.com/thephilosopher1923. As for Boston Review, far more likely you'll have heard of them than us. Boston Review is an independent non-profit public space for the discussion of ideas and culture. They publish new online essays several times a week on topics including the arts, law, gender and sexuality, race, philosophy and science, all of it 100% free to read. They also publish 4 themed print issues per year. I'll put full links to The Philosopher, our Patreon page, Boston Review, including a link to their forthcoming issue on imagining global futures in the box below this video. Turning now to today's event, how can we create a world in which human beings are truly friends of animals rather than exploiters or users? The world needs an ethical awakening, a consciousness-raising movement of international proportions. In this event, Martha Nussbaum, one of the world's most influential philosophers and humanists, will defend a revolutionary approach to animal rights, ethics, and law. Both an urgent call to action and a manual for change, Nussbaum will look to philosophy, politics, and law to guide us towards meeting our ethical responsibilities to the other animals. So the context for this event is the forthcoming publication of Martha Nussbaum's new book, Justice for Animals, Our Collective Responsibility. That will be out at the beginning of January, published by Simon and Schuster. In order to save time, I've put the speaker bio for Martha Nussbaum and her conversation partner, Jeremy Bendik-Keymer, in the box below this video. But just to say a very brief overview, Martha C. Nussbaum is the Ernst Freund Distinguished Service Professor of Law and Ethics, appointed in the Philosophy Department and the Law School of the University of Chicago. Jeremy Bendik-Keymer is Professor of Philosophy at Case Western Reserve University. Jeremy is a former PhD student of Martha Nussbaum's, and in fact his forthcoming book, which will be published early next year by Bloomsbury, is called Nussbaum's Politics of Wonder, How the Mind's Original Joy is Revolutionary. So that's everything by way of introduction. As I said, there are more links and information you can find in the box below this video. Thanks very much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoy it.
Great. Anthony, thank you. And thanks to everybody who's tuning in. Thanks also to Boston Review. My name's Jeremy, and I'm speaking from land that is in violation of the 1795 Treaty of Greenville. Just before we dig into the book, I just want to remind folks that the Philosopher is completely listener and viewer and participant supported. So please think about giving it up to the Philosopher with a small donation if you can. This book is an incredibly rich book, Martha. It's, as you know, from what I've said on the back cover of it, I think it's one of your most focused books, and it's quite passionate. What I'm going to do is just very briefly introduce it for the listeners, because I've heard from past events like this that sometimes the listeners want to know a little bit about how the whole book is shaped, and then we'll dig into some questions. Okay, so this book is very, from the dedication, is described as a work of constructive mourning. And so I thought it was appropriate to just start by reading a little bit from the beginning, and then I'll just say something about the structure of the book. So Martha writes in the introduction on page 14, for me, this book is a work of love, and now what I might call constructive mourning, attempting to carry forward the commitments of a person the world has tragically lost. My daughter, Rachel Nussbaum, was my mentor and inspiration as I began. relatively late in life, to take a keen interest in the plight of non-human animals. After a PhD and a short teaching career in German intellectual history, she decided to follow her passion for animals to law school. Now, she and her husband lived in Seattle, close to places well suited for watching the whales and orcas that were her greatest passion. She was even luckier to get her ideal job as a lawyer with the animal legal organization Friends of Animals, working in the wildlife division in Denver, headed by the wonderful animal law expert Michael Harris. For 5 years, she worked on the legal problems of wild animals, including elephants trafficked into US zoos, wild horses threatened with culling by ranchers, endangered bisons, and so many others. She worked on briefs. She testified before state legislatures considering pro-animal laws. Rachel died in 2019 at the age of 47 of a drug-resistant fungal infection following a successful organ transplant. And as long as I live, I will see the sparkle in her green eyes and her subversive smile. This is not a book about that tragedy. This book is different. It looks forward, attempting to further the causes she loved with a theory she knew about and supported. This theory, a version of my capabilities approach, measures justice by asking whether people, or in this case, sentient animals, have been enabled by laws and institutions to live a decently flourishing life, as defined by a list of opportunities for choice and activity that the creature has or lacks in its political or legal context. So that's the beginning of the book. And if you're interested, the book centers on the central intuition of the capabilities approach, which is that human beings, as a certain kind of animal, and all animals, have a characteristic form of life. And the issue before proponents of the capabilities approach is to figure out how to respect that form of life and to promote its flourishing. I won't go through the structure of the book right now because I think it'll come up in the questions, but I do want to end with just a brief quote from the end of the book that I think captures the spirit of it, and then we'll dig into the first question. On really the last page of the book, but not a spoiler, not the last words of the book, Martha comes back to an image that was found in Citadels of Pride, her recent book following on the Me Too movement about misogyny. She says, Dante depicts the proud as bent over like hoops so that they can only see themselves and can't look out at the world or the faces of others. For millennia, in just this way, much of humanity has been looking only at humanity and never turning outward to look, really look, at the other sentient beings with whom we share this small and fragile planet. By now, things have changed, though partially and unevenly. There's more looking, more wonder, and in that connection, more compassion and outrage at what we have done and are doing. Okay, so I see that as the spirit of the book. So let me just dig into the first question. So Martha, what are you trying to do with your new book, Justice for Animals? What questions guided it and drove you through the process? And what did you learn from writing it?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Jeremy, for sharing this platform with me. It's a great honor. And I want to thank the Boston Review, too. So for years, I've been very dissatisfied with the two dominant theories that direct our practical efforts in the animal area. The first being what I call the so like us approach, the anthropocentric approach of the Non-Human Rights Project and Stephen Wise, which has directed lots of litigation and so forth, but it judges the worthiness of animals by their likeness to humans. And then the second, which is a lot better, but still not quite right, I think, is the utilitarian theory of Peter Singer and before him, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, which focuses on pain as the single bad thing, but I think flattens the world too much, leaving out the many things that animals are trying to do, such as social life, moving around in a large space, play, interspecies relationships. So I wanted to argue, and that's the main thing of the book, that a version of my version of the capabilities approach, which I co-originated with Amartya Sen, but I have my own particular version of it, that would be a better guide because it focuses on the idea that minimal justice is achieved only when a creature, in this case, each variety of animal, has the opportunity, and so capabilities are opportunities, has the opportunity to live a flourishing life of that species' own kind. So I think that theory is a much better guide to what we should be doing. It corresponds actually to what good scientists and sensitive judges are already doing. But I wanted to spell it out and, rigorously set it forth and give the arguments for and against the different views. And so those are the main questions that drove me through the process. Along the way, I had to include a lot of science to say what sentience is, what creatures are included in this. I had to talk about the tragic conflicts we get when the goods of one species are pitted against the goods of others. I had to devote separate chapters to companion animals and to wild animals. So all of that. And then I finally had to try to say something about the inadequacy and shortcomings of law and where law should be going. So what did I learn? Well, that was the great joy of writing this book. I read a huge amount of science. And in the last 30 years, there's really been a tremendous deepening of our knowledge of animal lives. So I learned so much. I knew already a lot about elephants, and then through Rachel, I knew a lot about whales and orcas. But I didn't know much about birds, for example. And I learned so much about the complicated intelligence and communicative powers of birds. So that was just a great joy, and I sprinkled that all the way through the book.
There's also a portion of the book that's focused on Christine Korsgaard's work that you admire quite a bit. I wonder if listeners to this would find that your approach to her work interesting.
Of course, I think that's not as influential yet, but I do think it's a marvelous book. It's a stunning book. And I agree with quite a lot of it because she discards a lot of the bad views of the historical Kant, and she develops her own view from both Kantian and Aristotelian materials. I have to say that Chris was a dissertation student of mine long before you were, and she wrote her dissertation with me and John Rawls on Aristotle and Kant. So I think there's a lot of Aristotle in there. But, I think toward the end of the book, she comes back, to my mind, too much to Kant, in that she says that because we're the only creatures capable of ethical deliberation, we're the only ones who can be active citizens on behalf of animals. Now, she clearly doesn't think this makes us better. She refuses all such ranking, but she does think it makes us the only ones who can take an active step politically to defend the rights of animals. But I say, look, animals are speaking all the time about what they want and what they don't want. Their behavior, their languages indicate so much about their preferences. And after all, with human children and people with cognitive disabilities, we don't have to wait till they can speak fluent English or whatever language. We listen to them and we look at them and we see what they're indicating by their behavior. We should be doing the same for animals. Animals are not passive. They can be participants in the political community. So that's my main difference with Chris.
Great. Well, maybe come back to that in a minute, but just to keep it general for now. So let's go to the next one. I'm going to want to talk to you about what you do with sentience in the book later, but just to not get it too specific right now. Just generally, how does this book relate to your philosophical work? We've said a little bit, but is there more to say? Does it have ties to work you've done in the past? How far back? I think of your De Motu Animalium. And why did you feel the need to do this work now, beyond your allegiance to Rachel?
Well, I think it does go back to my doctoral dissertation on Aristotle's De Motu Animalium, because he said that we really need a common explanation for the movement of both humans and other animals towards their goals, that whatever the differences are, there's a common framework, that all creatures use forms of perception and forms of desire to get going, to move toward their objects of desire. And so, yes, it does go back to that. But I guess I also think, it's very obvious that it goes back to my first writings on the capabilities approach in Women and Human Development, Frontiers of Justice, which has a chapter on animals, and finally keep creating capabilities. But I think it also goes back to my work on emotions, because I do talk about wonder and compassion. And of course, you've said so much better things about wonder, but I do pick up on the things you've said. And, my work hangs together, I think, around the issue of seeing living beings as vulnerable to accidents beyond their control. And my work on emotions says that emotions are ways of getting in touch with the goods outside ourselves that we don't control, and that they're valuable in practical reasoning and valuable in life, because they do put us in touch with what it is to have or lose or find threatened, a good thing outside ourselves that we don't control. So all the emotion work is hangs together with the capabilities approach through this idea of vulnerability. And capabilities are things that need to be protected because we're vulnerable beings. We don't automatically have life, bodily integrity, bodily health, and all the other things on my capabilities list. But we need those spaces to be protected for us precisely because of our vulnerability. So yeah, I think it's connected to virtually all of my work in that way. Why now? Well, why now? I guess, I mean, it just seemed like the time has come when in my own work, because I broached the topic in Frontiers of Justice, but I really didn't work it out in detail, but also because the world has gotten to a point where I think the world is ready to hear about this. There's so much going on, and I hear every day from people who are for the first time feeling a passion to do something for animal rights. But I also feel that science has taken such strides that now we can no longer say, oh, birds are stupid or whatever. We know too much, and people are really interested in the science too. Scientists have written very well, and they have these wonderful books with pictures and so forth. So we can learn, and so now we have no excuse to really be behind the learning that's available to us.
I mean, one thing that strikes me in reading the book is that I don't think I've read a book of yours that is so far-reaching in the way that it characterizes domination in the world. I mean, the picture of this book is one of a world where you pretty much say animals everywhere live directly or indirectly dominated by human societies. And you have a problem with that. The implications are really profound. Yeah, I'm curious if you could say, I've never heard you go that far.
The capabilities approach was really about the idea of domination. And we've had lots of discussions with Phil Pettit and others about what exactly is the relation between his idea of non-domination and Sen's and my idea of freedom and capability. But with animals, what I wanted people to understand that there is no space on the land, in the sea, and in the air that's not dominated by human beings. It's just not possible to say, oh, we can leave them alone and back off. No, everywhere human beings dominate. So on the land, the most free animals is in a large wildlife refuge that's policed and tended, if it's tended well, by human beings in an African nation. And in the seas, I think people think the seas are a great bastion of wildness and freedom, but in fact, they're really full of things that human beings have put there. Plastic, whales dying because they swallow plastic trash, and finding a whale dead with 88 pounds of plastic trash calcified into a plastic brick in its stomach, but also the pollution of sound. Whales and other marine mammals negotiate the world much more by sound than by sight or smell. But what they find is not just the sonar programs. Actually, the US Navy's sonar program has been declared illegal now by a very good judgment that I talk about quite a lot in the book, which says it has an adverse impact on the life activities of whales. But that's only in the coastal waters. Out in the wild, so to speak, oil companies are trying to drill. And before they can decide where they're going to drill, they have to figure out what the cartography of the ocean floor is. And they send air bombs down. So every 30 seconds, some oil company is sending an air bomb down to the ocean floor. And of course, this has a terrible effect on the migration patterns, the reproduction, the energy, the emotional stability of marine mammal population. In the air, about half the migratory species that we have are threatened now. And one big threat is air pollution, but another is just buildings. Christmas lights, there was a big article today in the Chicago Tribune, quite good one, about how don't put up your Christmas lights because you're killing birds. but buildings. So I have my office, as you know, in a building that's made of glass. And last spring, there was a shift in the migration route of some species of birds. They started crashing into our building and dead birds were found all over the place. So that's what we do, and we can stop it, but we just don't take care. So what people are now starting to do is to put stickers on the buildings to make it clear to the birds that that's solid space, not clear air. But anyway, the point is human beings are negligent, and they're not always malignant. They don't always intend to cause harm, but negligence is also a crime, you know, and we're a very negligent species because we just don't know what's going on.
So you were talking about whales, and you have the central example of Hal, who eats dies of plastic ingestion. Rachel, of course, focused on whales in her work. What was it like to collaborate on substantial parts of this work with Rachel? And how did the work you did together relate to her vocation and purpose? And how would she hope that we develop the work that you two did and that now you have done?
Well, as you mentioned, she had a passion for whales and other marine mammals. And in law school already, she wrote 3 really fine papers, which were the basis for later collaborations. And so basically, we wrote 4 articles together. One was about a general point about what goes beyond utilitarianism. What do we need in a theory that goes beyond utilitarianism? The second one was about the complaint that some practitioners of harpoon whaling make, that it destroys the life of indigenous peoples. So that's a serious objection that we really had to talk about quite a lot. The third addresses the other Japanese complaint, namely that they think their scientific knowledge requires killing whales. And that is actually quite a hypocritical claim, I think, at this point. But anyway, we had to address that in a separate article. And the last one was in a symposium about friendship between human beings and other animals. And that was more general. It wasn't just about whales. But anyway, typically, you know, she supplied the law and in the papers she'd already written, which we had to then rewrite. And I supplied the capabilities approach philosophy. But we just had a lot of fun doing it. And she would come to the meetings of the Human Development and Capabilities Association, and with wonderful people like you and Amy Lynch, Brina Holland, we presented them on panels, and we tried to convince the other members of that association to take these issues to heart. Not always successfully. They often thought, oh, human beings are so much in need that we really should focus on human beings, but we tried hard. But anyway, it was really, really, really fun. And when I talked about seeing the gleam in her green eyes, yeah, she was a very subversive and humorous person. Not always clear to others because she's shy, or was shy. But anyway, that was part of the fun of it, that we would enjoy shaking things up and making an inroad.
At one of the HDCA, Human Development and Capability Association meetings, the one in Cape Town, you mention it in the book, there was quite an uproar when you gave a lecture on, I believe it was on elephants, is that right?
Well, there was kind of on elephants, but my lecture was more general. It was kind of a
yes
for the book.
But you talk about, you actually have a paragraph in this book. I won't be able to find it right on the spot, but you say that the uproar in the association had to do with the concern that your focus on other animals would take people away from addressing pressing issues of human development. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about this concern, what you say in the book.
Well, okay. It's, I think it was not well thought through. I never heard this. You told me about this objection. They didn't bring it to me. But I think there are in this area certainly some genuinely tragic dilemmas. I talk about some of those in my chapter on tragic dilemmas, where it does look like the two groups are pitted in a kind of tragic way for life and sustenance. One might be elephants and African villagers. Elephants need tree bark to live, and they need all the kinds of things that are in villages. And of course, they're not malevolent, and elephants are actually very gentle and harmless creatures, but they really do take things that villagers need. So here we really need to figure out, and my approach in all these areas is to ask, what would a world be like in which those tragic dilemmas don't arise anymore? What can we do to fix the world, to, as Hegel would put it, aufheben the conflict? And here, I think that's one of the most difficult ones, because it really requires, first of all, limiting human populations. Let's face it, these things arise because human beings are too numerous, and the elephants can't be. Sometimes I think we might want to limit animal population where an animal can't sustain itself in its given habitat. So elks, for example, we might need to, I think, use contraception to limit the elk population. But for the most part, it's the humans who need to adapt, and certainly not the elephants, because they're an endangered species. So that's part of the problem, is that. But I think also, you know, people have just gotten used to not taking animals seriously. And they think that anything we do for animals will take away from us. Where I would like to say, and you've said this often very well, that a full development of our humanity requires developing our capacities to care for the world of nature and for the animals in it. And we should see it much more in a positive terms than in a zero-sum terms.
So 30 years ago, even, animal ethics was marginal in philosophy. Now it's increasingly mainstream. Has your relationship to philosophy changed at all in the course of building toward and then writing this book over the last decades? And what about in your involvement with the HDCA? I think we just touched on that, which is affiliated indirectly with the UN.
Yeah, well, I'm never a person who dismisses a profession. And in fact, I don't even have a PhD in philosophy. I have a PhD in classics, but I always gravitated to philosophy because I think of it as so rigorous, and I feel I grow much more in that field than I would in any other field that I've been attached to in one way or another. So I haven't been alienated from the field. I've still felt it's the source of the best critiques and the most rigorous theories and so on. But I have thought it needs to change to make room for, actually not just for animals, but also for the voices of non-Western peoples and cultures. And that's something that we've been working on in the department recently. Tried unfortunately, unsuccessfully, to hire Harvey Lederman from Princeton, who is a great practitioner of Chinese philosophy. I just had a session on animals with him at Princeton. It was our online session because I gave a lecture at Princeton. So anyway, we were working hard on that part, but the animal part, I think it's very, very important, and it's just as important as philosophy of race and philosophy of gender, and it's been left out. So what I do is I bring it in, and I just hope that my colleagues, I think they are increasingly beginning to realize that it does belong. I'm very glad when I did this session inaugurating a new program in animal law at our law school to see two of my colleagues actually leave the hiring interviews for an assistant professorship to come over to that session. And of course, I was missing this interview too. But anyway, to see that people cared enough to go to that session. I think people are beginning, to see how important it actually is. And I'm very, very glad to see this. And so many good young people coming along in philosophy, but also in law. My law students have become really enamored of this issue. I taught the book as a seminar, and the seminar had 2 graduate students in philosophy, but the rest were all law students. They gave me such wonderful comments, and now they're graduating this year, and they're doing things like starting pro bono programs at their law firms, and they're really going to keep up the work. And I think having a theory enabled them to feel that they could keep up the work as a part of their intellectual life, not just as a part of their philanthropy or their personal conduct. So I'm delighted, and I think the more students I teach, the better. Next year, I'm pioneering a 1L elective that will be taught, not for the whole 1L class, but it's the first time they can take an elective course. So probably 50 or so will take it. And so the word is going out. And as for the Human Development and Capabilities Association, it is, first of all, it's not really part of the United Nations anymore. It developed out of the United Nations University, but it's an independent organization. I think, by now, Amartya Sen and other big prominent people in the association do take the animal issue seriously. At first, Amartya didn't. He actually thought it was just my own particular peculiarity or something, but I think now he does. But there are people who don't, and the economics profession, I think, which is such a dominant profession, is a little bit slow to take up any new idea, because people go into economics largely because they're good at math these days, and they gain success because they're good at math. So thinking normatively about a new issue is not really what they're trained to do and not really what they want to do. So I'm really worried about the association. And I've, of course, look at that name, the Human Development and Capability Association. Well, I think I've proposed and I've written that we really should just call it the Development and Capability Association. It's not just humans. And well, anyway, we should be thinking much more about these issues.
So we have about 5 minutes before we're going to open it up for everyone. And Anthony's going to start by moderating the questions first. But I want to ask a slightly more specific question that goes back to the first bit about course guard. So I mentioned, you mentioned this your relationship to the discipline of philosophy, very sympathetic one. The discipline of philosophy has at least of late, let's put it that way, of late could be centuries long, it could be longer depending on how you read it, really privileged human exceptionalism, human superiority, and usually by emphasizing the property of, or the capacity of reason, or the property of reason. One of the things that's in, and also in political philosophy, it's quite common to base theories of citizenship on the capacity to, say, deliberate. But one of the things that's surprising in your book and in your capabilities approach is that you really push toward a broader form of intelligence, which you group under sentience, right? So you talk about how your theory of justice is dependent on the standard animal package, in which, to put it, there's some various dimensions to it, but to put it simply, the animal must be sentient. It has a particular form of subjectivity. And in your critique of course guard, the problem with the Kantian approach is it still won't let go of the categorical distinctness of reasoning. And you develop a kind of continuum. You say we need to look at the continuum. And in your discussion of citizenship, you are quite strong against people, for example, in environmental ethics like Stephen Vogel, who's very influential in talking about how animals actually make demands. And you just have to learn how to understand their communication and so on. So could you say a little bit, just on the way out, this is a bit more of a technical question to close out, about what you're doing with the hallowed category of reason, or if you want to flip it around, what you're doing with animal sentience and citizenship?
First of all, I guess I think we have to learn much more science. We really have to see that animals are capable of many forms of reasoning and problem solving. So I think one problem with Chris is she doesn't seem aware of what scientists have discovered in the last 30 years. Animals are great problem solvers, and they also reason normatively. They solve ethical problems, and they make peace, and they settle conflicts, often better than we humans do. So the continuum includes a continuum in moral reasoning and in the part of rationality that consists of having a variety of sophisticated emotions. Every biologist now who works on animals thinks they have emotions and that their emotions embody. Franz de Waal, for example, has written a lot about this, Mark Beckhoff. Emotions embody thoughts about good and ill, and that's why they evolved. That's why animals have them. So we must, first of all, not wave reason like a flag of separateness. We must understand how it permeates the animal world. But sentience means to me, and it's what it means in the biologists that I draw from, having somebody at home inside. In other words, having a distinctive perspective on the world. And experiments now show that animals of all kinds have this property. Being able to feel pain is not the whole of it, of course. Having subjective perception is much broader than pain, but pain is the easiest thing to do experimental research on. And we now know that fish, for example, feel pain. So then it's more disputed. Crustaceans are very much in dispute. cephalopods do seem to have sentience, the octopus, the squid, and so on. But crustaceans in dispute, and insects very much in dispute. The consensus right now about insects, and here, by the way, there's a very fine philosophical book on this by Michael Tye that concludes that insects do not have sentience. But anyway, whatever the empirics of it turn out to be, I think the crucial thing is the philosophical issue, that having that ability really is a dividing line between creatures that are like someone's and creatures that are not. Now, that doesn't mean we can use the rest of nature in any old way, or that there's no ethical imperative to treat the rest of nature well. I think, of course, there are many ethical reasons to treat nature well, but justice to me, and I say this from chapter 1 on, justice is a matter of having a striving being who is wrongfully thwarted in its striving. So that's why sentience matters, because it's a necessary condition of striving, so to speak. So I think sentience is important, and I do not think that plants are sentient, although I think there are many, many reasons, some instrumental and some intrinsic, for treating plants and the world of nature well. But my book is about justice.
Great. So it develops a particular tradition of justice, and the result is that it quite broadens our community.
Right.
Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Anthony. Thanks, Martha. This was great for starters.
Jeremy,
I'll be back in a minute with someone else.
Okay.
Yeah, you bet.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, Martha. So inevitably, there are a lot of questions, and that's why Jeremy and I are going to alternate them so that we've got time to think. So I thought I'd just start at the top. So the first question that came in is from Chris, who asks, can you give us the top 3 capabilities that relate to humans that may apply as well to most animals at this stage of our consciousness?
Okay, I think actually, if you look at my version of the capabilities list, all of the boldface rubrics apply just as much to animals. I'm ready to admit I'm wrong if I'm shown to be wrong, but I think the first 3, I wouldn't say the top 3, but the first 3 on the list are life, bodily health, bodily integrity. But then I would go on to include all the other senses, imagination and thought, affiliation, practical reason, meaning to be able to make choices about how your life goes, play, relationships with other species in the world of nature, control over your material environment. So I think all actually are pertinent to animal lives.
Thank you, Martha. Do you want me to have a go with another one, Jeremy, or do you want to chip in at this point?
I've got one for a minute. So this is from Elizabeth Shilling. Is it truly the overpopulation of humans, or is it the unnecessary excess of production, consumerism, and commercialism / business agendas that can be scaled back, limited, and converted to spaces and practices that contribute to earth and animal healing and regrowth? So in other words, is it a particular form of civilization and its economy that's really at stake?
Well, I think, both are in question, obviously. The oil rigs that are out there drilling, that is an incursion into the seas that I think we would be better off without. But, the fact is, in the case I was talking about, elephants in Africa, people are living at a very rudimentary subsistence level in these villages. There are just an awful lot of them. And the elephants are very few in number, but they do need to strip the bark off of trees. So whole organizations have grown up to mediate those conflicts. But one way they need to be mediated, and it really is to give women a chance to regulate their own fertility. It's partly a gender dominance issue because men don't want to use contraception often, and the women would quite like them to do that.
Thank you, Jeremy. Are you happy for me to chip in? Okay, Martha. So there's a couple of questions about, I suppose we'd call them sort of boundary issues. So Martin asks, please, could you elaborate on where you think justice for animals finishes and justice for non-sentient beings begin? Examples include, do insects deserve justice? What about ecosystems? And how about bacteria? Related to that is a question from an anonymous attendee, which is basically asking whether you would extend the capabilities approach to the ethics of AI. If not, what is the key difference between animals and artificial intelligence according to your model?
Okay, the first one, according to the way that I understand justice, it pertains only to beings who are sentient, because it's about the wrongful thwarting of a certain kind of striving, which requires perception to get you going toward the object of desire. So it's the things that Aristotle talks about in the De Motu Animalium. Now, insects do many things in the world, but according to me and according to current scientific research, they're not subjects of a theory of justice because they're not striving creatures. The world doesn't look like anything in particular to them. They don't have goals and so on. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have any duties to insects. It's just not justice that we're talking about. And the same is true of plants. Now, what kind of ethical duties might we have? Insects are very important, first of all, instrumentally in the lives of sentient beings. So there's that whole set of duties that we might have to preserve insect population. But also they may have intrinsic interest and worth. That's just not the part of ethics that I'm writing about. I'm writing about justice. So that's somebody else can defend the intrinsic importance of insect life and plant life, and I'd be very glad for them to do that. Now, AI is tricky. I don't know anything much about AI, and I really have never studied it, and I do know that that's a really complicated issue. I guess the question would be whether robots, for example, can be sentient, and I guess that's a big question in that literature too, how you think about sentience in that connection. And I would just wait to hear from people who know a lot more than I do about AI to see how they think about that issue.
Okay, so I'm going to group several questions here. An anonymous question, a question from Kevin Elliott, and then another anonymous question. There's a number of people who are interested in basically the ethics of eating, but not just humans eating other animals, but animals eating other animals.
Oh.
So the first part of the question from Kevin is, what if the characteristic form of flourishing of a species includes the hunting and devouring of other species, right? It seems plausible that hunting species, that hunting species experience powerful fulfillment through a hunt successfully executed. Does justice require enabling such opportunities? Then the one with humans, and not between other animals, but with humans, has to do with, what's your stance on veganism? What's your stance on eating meat? This kind of thing.
Okay, so let me do the second one first. On veganism, I do not think that the arguments for not using any form of animal product are good arguments. For example, wool. Now, sheep that are not regularly shorn, as they've now evolved to be, they suffer from having their heavy coat dragging them down. And so I agree with Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka that there are forms of use that are perfectly okay. I agree with them too, that eggs may be okay if they're totally cage-free and if we make sure that the animal still has options to reproduce. Dairy industry is much more difficult, as again, Kimlicka and Donaldson say, because there's no way to reform it to make it ethically adequate, I think, because the calf has to be taken from its mother. But in any case, so I agree with veganism in some respects, but not in all. In terms of eating, I feel that so far, so the first thing is we have to ask that old philosophical question, when is death a harm, and is it a harm, and for whom? Now, that's an issue that goes way back to Epicurus, who said, well, death isn't a harm because we're not there after we die, and the termination, if it's painless, is not itself a harm. So I object to that. I find fault with Epicurus's argument because I say what's wrong with death is the interruption of activities that you value. So if they're cut short in midstream, that harms the shape of your life ex post. So I do think death can be a harm for a being who's got valuable projects underway. I do think that includes most animals, certainly until they get very old and decrepit. If somebody, has no projects any longer, then maybe, but my grandmother was 104 and she still had lots of projects underway, and I hope I will too. But, an animal that's getting to the old end of the species is not going to be eaten anyway, so that doesn't come up. Most of the animals who are eaten are either very young, which is always totally unacceptable, I think, like lambs and calves and so on, or they're in their prime. And again, if they're animals that have a sense of time and the projects evolving through time, that's a harm to that animal. I do right now believe that it's different for fish. So utilitarians from Bentham to Jeff McMahon have said that animals live in the moment. They don't have these projects evolving through time. I think they're wrong about most animals, but I do think that they're right about fish. I think that's how fish think. And therefore, the painless death of a fish, and I really mean painless, not line fishing, but conking with a mallet, for example, the painless death of a fish who's had plenty of time to swim around in the wild and has had a pretty decent life overall is not a harm to the fish, I believe. And so I actually do eat fish, and I am less troubled about that than I needing 70 grams of protein a day to stay healthy with my age and my exercise level. I feel happier about that than I feel about any dairy product that I might use. So, it's something I wonder about, and I don't feel happy about it. I want to still learn more, but that's where I am right now. Now, about the first question, I think there are positions that say, well, again, Jeff McMahon, he wrote an op-ed, which I think was not a serious philosophical statement, and people should not take it as that, but just floating the question, should we eliminate by gradual outbreeding predatory species because of the harm that they do? Now, of course, that has drastic implications for the ecosystem, so that's one problem. But there's, these animals are not doing anything wrong. They're not deliberately inflicting harm. When humans kill other humans, we should expect them not to do that. But I think with most predatory animals, that's not the case. Now, nonetheless, so I reject McMahon's proposal. There's another proposal made by some neo-Aristotelians, not me, that says, well, this is what they're put there for. Just as the tiger is there to kill a gazelle, so the gazelle's purpose, telos, is to be eaten by the tiger. No, that's just bogus Aristotelianism. That's not what Aristotle. Each species, we know, evolved to live, not to die. And they're there because they were capable of surviving. And in this case, they're being harmed and eaten up by a predator. So what do we do about that? I think we have to face up to the fact that they're being harmed. But what can we do about those harms? In companion life and animal life, I think we do try to do something about it. So with cats, who are certainly very enamored of killing birds, most companions of cats do not let their cats kill little birds, either by keeping them indoors or if they're outside by just taking them away from that activity. But they recognize that this is an innate instinct, so they give the cat a substitute activity, playing with a ball, playing with a scratching post, and so all the things that good cat companions do. Can we do that with other species in the wild? Well, of course, we could do it only if we put them each in a separate enclosure, like a cat in a home. And that would really not be very good for the lives of these creatures for the most part. So I don't see that as a solution. When tigers are in zoos, in fact, that is what they do. They feed them humanely killed meat, and then they give them some other activity. And of course, we know that that works. Humans have evolved to do things like playing football instead of killing other humans, although I don't think that that is a very successful deflection of an aggressive instinct. But anyway, I think, we just know too little to even venture in this direction. But the first thing that it's sort of at the margins, I think we can tinker with this. And I suggest in the book that at least we can say to people, don't make money out of exploiting this desire to see blood and gore. If you go on safaris, you know that people love to shell out a lot of money to go to Botswana and watch wild dogs jump on a little gazelle and tear it limb from limb before it's even dead. Horrible death. But when I went on this safari, there were like 4 of the 6 in my Jeep were there for that reason. One was a bird watcher and the other one was me. But it's really, bloodlust, like the Roman gladiatorial games. And I think it's very unseemly for a nation like Botswana to prop that up artificially, inflating the numbers of wild dogs, really breeding wild dogs to fight in the arena, so to speak. And so I think we should just stop that, what I call sado-tourism. And that will at least show a recognition that the lives of these antelopes make a difference. But beyond that, I think we have to just hands off until we know a lot more.
Jeremy, are you happy for me to chip in with a question, or have you got one lined up? Okay, super. So a short clarificatory question, Martha. This is from Tonya, who notes that she's not a lawyer, but I believe that she heard you say that negligence was a crime. Could you clarify?
Well, negligence is illegal. Well, yeah, sorry. I mean, obviously you can be sued for negligence, and there are legally established criteria for saying that you have been wrongfully negligent. No, there's sometimes it actually comes into the criminal law. Different nations divide between civil law and criminal law in different ways. So like reckless endangerment can be a criminal offense, even though it's not deliberate and so forth. But anyway, the point is, I'm talking about both negligence and malice.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to ask a question posed by Jamie Woodhouse, which is about farming. So Jamie says, many people will be with us as we talk about companion and wild animals. They may even join us in condemning factory farming, yet they'll remain desperate to find some justification for continuing animal agriculture, even while claiming to respect and care for its victims. How can we break through those powerful social norms and push towards ending all needless exploitation, harming and killing of sentient beings? And then he finishes by saying, being farmed can never be, quote, just.
No, I totally agree, but I am an incrementalist, and I think the best course is to end the worst abuses first, so if we were left with only humanely raised pigs and chickens, that would still be bad, but it would be a lot better than the factory farming industry. And right now, politically, the factory farming industry has such a lock grip on our whole political process through the money that's bottled up there. So you can't pass any law that doesn't have an exemption for the factory farming industry. We have these ag-gag laws that forbid people to divulge the conditions in the factory farming industry. And those have been challenged in every state where they exist, but they haven't been repealed yet or declared unconstitutional in all the states. So we need to fight on that first front and get this horrendous industry out of our political lives. One of the things that is a funny thing, so the Iowa primary, changing the order of the primaries may well make a difference, because all the politicians used to descend on Iowa, and that meant that no one who didn't stand up for a photo op with a pork sausage in their hand could ever be taken seriously in politics. Well, who knows what South Carolina will bring forth, but in any case, I think, that's the first battle line. So a politician like Cory Booker, who's the only one in the national realm, well, Eric Adams, I guess, but who really care about these issues, could never be nominated for president, but maybe now he'll have more of a chance. So anyway, that's part of it. But I totally agree that the larger issue is an issue about how livelihoods can be changed. And it's a large issue, because every time we make an ethical improvement in some area of our lives, there are people who are put out of work. So when in Britain they ended fox hunting, the big complaint was all the people who work in that industry, what are they going to do? Right now, when a lot of whales are killed by lobster fishing lines that are used to hold the lobster pot as it goes down into the floor of the ocean, and these lines get wrapped around the whale's body and slash it and cause a terribly painful death. The debate around that is about how these fishermen are going to live. Well, you have to think about that. But I think there are Hegelian solutions, which are there's a new form of lobster line that doesn't cause that problem and so forth. So we need to think how these people are going to live, maybe in the same industry, but maybe in a different industry. A lot of the people who are employed in the tobacco industry have not totally died, but they've found other jobs in other industries. And that's the way the world of the economy works. So we have to, in thinking about the ending of humane farming, we would then really have to take care for the people who work in that industry and finding them employment. Absolutely.
I just got a note from Anthony. Did you want me to close out, Anthony, in some way?
In some way, like I just thought you could have the
I'm happy
final
to.
thing if you want to ask a final question to Martha. Any final things before we sign off? Thank you.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's lots of questions that are unanswered. And Martha, if I can, I will copy them and send them to you. But I mean, I should just say this is really, and I said this on the back cover of the book, this is really a very focused book. It has an ardent love of life on Earth, of living animals on Earth in it. And I really hope that people who are trying to work through these complexities, many of which are reflected in the chat, will take a look at the book. Martha, what are you interested in doing next in relationship to this book? I think that's my last question. And obviously that's in the spirit of the book's focus as a constructive act of mourning.
Well, I'm really interested in talking to anyone who wants to talk about it. And I'm spending a lot of time doing podcasts, interviews, and so on. So that's the first thing. But then, I'm teaching a new course, as I mentioned, a new law student course. And I'm really prepared to travel here and travel there. But I like the fact that the book selling trade has changed in the last, I guess, since COVID. It's much more online, and therefore I can talk to more people. And I'm doing another podcast in a couple of hours. So instead of flying here and flying there, I can do a lot more at home, which is kind of nice. And I really love talking to people about these issues in this book. I'm writing about other things right now. I'm actually writing a book about Benjamin Britten's War Requiem and about the whole issue of war and peace. And you know, it's not unrelated, because Britten's first important work was a short song cycle called Our Hunting Fathers, which was a condemnation of the whole domination mindset. He got expelled from school for writing an essay on justice for animals, actually opposing hunting and fishing for sport. But then he took that insight into further insights about war and the origins of warlike aggression. So I'm continuing the work in a completely different context too.